council members and participants. We are now live.
Thank you. I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. I now note that the hour has come. Sydney Sherrills, would you please call the roll to take attendance? Members that are in attendance will please indicate that you are present when your name is called. Also, please say a few brief words when responding so that your image will be displayed on screen when you speak.
Vice Chair Jones.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, viewing public.
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson. Councilmember Quinones Sanchez. Councilmember Bass.
Good morning, Madam Chair, colleagues, and viewing public. Thank you.
Good morning.
Councilmember Skula. Councilmember Dom.
Good morning, Madam Chair, colleagues, and Philadelphia.
Councilmember Brooks.
Good morning, Madam Chair and colleagues in Philadelphia. I'm present.
And Councilmember Parker.
Are we at quorum? Sydney, are we at quorum?
We need one more.
Okay. Let me see.
Councilmember is in the hearing, though.
Okay, hold on one second. There he is.
Here, Madam Chair. I don't know. I somehow got disconnected. I jumped back on again. But good morning. I am present.
Good morning. Very good. Thank you. Now a quorum of this committee has been established and this hearing is now called to order. This is the public hearing of the Committee on Housing, Neighborhood Development, and the Homeless regarding resolution number 211029. Ms. Sherrills, will you please read the title of the resolution?
Resolution number 211029, authorizing the Philadelphia City Council Committee on Housing, Neighborhood Development, and the Homeless to conduct public hearings to explore the crisis of expiring affordable housing subsidies and the impact of those expirations on the available affordable housing in the city of Philadelphia.
Before we begin to hear testimony from the witnesses we have for today, everyone who has been invited to the meeting to testify should be aware that this public hearing is being recorded. Because the hearing is public, participants and viewers have no reasonable expectation of privacy. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. Additionally, prior to recognizing members for the questions or comments they have for witnesses, I will note for the record at this time that we will use the chat feature available in Microsoft Teams to allow members to signify that they wish to be recognized. In order to comply with the Sunshine Act, the chat feature must only be used for this purpose. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few brief remarks about the affordable housing crisis the city is currently experiencing. Good morning to my colleagues and everyone watching at home. Thank you for attending this hearing of the Committee on Housing, Neighborhood Development, and the Homeless. Today, we will be focusing on the affordable housing crisis that is being exacerbated by opt-outs from affordable housing subsidies. Many of us have known for years that there is an affordable housing crisis and that many individuals across our city and the nation are unable to keep up with the skyrocketing cost of living on salaries that have not increased in any meaningful way in decades. To make matters worse, during a time when more state and federal dollars than ever are needed to ease this crisis, we are seeing a steady decline in the funding allocated to creating and preserving affordable housing. Data on Philadelphia renters shows that there are more than 140,000 renter households in the city, making less than $35,000 annually. And of those households, 53% pay more than half of their household income on rent payments. A report from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition details this affordability crisis in shocking detail. In order to afford the average rent for a 2-bedroom unit in Philadelphia, an individual would need to have an annual household income of $50,400 or $24.23 an hour. At minimum wage, that means a person would have to work 3 full-time jobs or work for 132 hours a week to afford an average 2-bedroom. This is simply not sustainable. The only permanent affordable housing in Philadelphia is housing owned by the Philadelphia Housing Authority. All the remaining federally subsidized affordable housing have contracts or rent restrictions that expire at some point in the future. Our focus today is on those affordable rental units that could be lost when these contracts or restrictions expire. These affordable units are in developments that were either financed through the federal low-income housing tax credit program or are operating with rent subsidies under what is called project-based Section 8 contracts. Over the next 5 years, 117 affordable developments in Philadelphia with 5,430 affordable units will reach the point where these affordability contracts will expire and owners will be allowed to opt out of maintaining these units as affordable. When we look forward 10 years, that number balloons to 218 projects and 12,286 units. While new affordable housing is being built in Philadelphia, it's not being built fast enough to keep up with the increasing demands, putting an even greater strain on the rental market. Like many components of affordable housing, this danger disproportionately affects low-income Black Philadelphians as the primary residents of these units. For this reason, the preservation of these housing units is a critical racial equity issue for Philadelphia. With the private real estate market hotter than it's ever been, there are powerful economic incentives for private owners to opt out of their affordability contracts, thereby permanently removing these units from Philadelphia's already limited affordable housing inventory. Today's hearing is about preserving the affordable housing stock that we already have in the city of Philadelphia and what we as a city government need to be doing to ensure that these units remain affordable over the long term. We as a collective have a responsibility to provide housing that will not bankrupt our citizens. We must create innovative federal, state, and local partnerships, allocate more funding, and develop regulatory solutions. I hope that the testimony we hear during today's hearing will help highlight solutions and a path forward. I'm also very grateful that we will have some of Philadelphia's residents joining us today who are experiencing the effects of these opt-outs as we speak, so that we can ground ourselves in the perspectives of our constituents. Thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to getting started. Before we move on, are there any members of the committee that would like to give opening comments as well? Okay. Ms. Sherrills, will you please call the first panel or witness we have to testify this morning?
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Hi, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson. Are you just be present?
Thank you. I just wanted to be recorded as present for the hearing. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Good morning. Ms. Sherrills, can you please call the first panel?
Panel 1, Vincent Reyna, Vince O'Donnell, and Melissa Long.
Wonderful. Vincent, can you please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony?
Sure, Vincent Reyna. So first, I want to thank you all for having me here today. Thank you to Councilmember Gautier and her fellow council members for focusing on preservation needs in Philadelphia. Thank you to the residents of subsidized housing who are at the meeting today, as well as those who could not be here, for all their work to ensure that policy solutions are responsive to their lived experience and expertise. And thank you to the many people working on the topic of preservation, including the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC, which leads preservation work both locally and nationally, as well as Deputy Mayor Ann Fedulin and Melissa Long, who has championed these issues. Meaningful progress on the preservation of subsidized housing requires ongoing commitment from government officials and partnership between them and the many organizations and people in the room here today. My name is Vincent Reyna, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania and the faculty director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. In 2018, I helped the city of Philadelphia write its 10-year housing plan alongside LISC. That plan endorsed and adopted much of the framework and solutions proposed by the city's Preservation Task Force, which I had the opportunity to work with 2 years prior. I was asked to provide some framing comments today, many of which are meant to be broad, but all of which I would gladly dive into further going forward. The first thing to keep in mind is that what we are seeing at University City townhomes is not new, nor is it a one-time event. The U.S. government has long used public-private partnerships whereby the government subsidizes a private owner to develop a property and maintain it for a fixed period of time to produce housing generally and affordable housing specifically. This model emerged in the 1960s and has become the primary means through which subsidized housing is created and maintained outside of the public housing program. This development model extends beyond just federal programs and applies to local ones as well, including current production programs in Philadelphia. And with this model comes several distinct opportunities and challenges. As I outlined in a paper published at the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy in 2018, and has been shown in the work by scholars like Dr. Catherine Howell at Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as researchers at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, there are distinct risks facing our existing subsidized housing stock. These risks include expiration risk. Expiration risk means that at various points, an owner's obligation to remain in affordable housing programs could come to an end. The commitment is often outlined through the original subsidy contract between the owner and the government, but it could also be tied to things like the land the property is developed on. In some programs, like project-based Section 8, subsidy contracts are renewable, and some owners can and do renew their subsidy for another set period of time. For other programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the partnership in the program ends at the fixed period, and an owner would need to reapply for a new round of support to technically remain in the program. A subsidy contract ending or expiring means that the legal obligations tied to that subsidy, which requires units to be affordable, also end. However, sometimes units do remain affordable. In some cases, additional affordability restrictions exist beyond the subsidy contract, or other local protections might be triggered. For example, some localities require that all units exiting subsidy programs must adhere to some form of rent control or rent regulation model that only allows for gradual price increases. Finally, absent any support or regulations, some owners may choose not to increase rents, but the absence of legal obligations allows them to do so at any point in time. The second challenge is depreciation and rehabilitation risk, which is the risk that a building becomes uninhabitable. Much of our existing subsidized housing stock is old and in need of significant investment. Property investments are essential for both the well-being of the households in the property and the viability of the property themselves. If these needs are not met, a property subsidy contract can be revoked. Finally, there is appropriations risk, which stems from the uncertainty around whether and at what level the federal and local government will fund subsidy programs. Some subsidized housing properties have provisions in their contracts saying assistance is subject to annual appropriations, while others have contracts for programs that no longer exist and therefore cannot be renewed. The appropriation risk also applies to having sufficient resources to reinvest in the properties when repairs and upgrades are needed. In all settings, this means that preservation is tied to a government commitment to the subsidized units that are in existence, including addressing their ongoing needs. The three risks are not mutually exclusive. They can all three can affect our subsidized properties at the same time. Preservation needs are reoccurring, and the conversation we have here today should extend to how we think about what is being subsidized and produced now, because those are potential future preservation needs. The next important framing point is to think about why we preserve properties. First, in a city like Philadelphia, there's a shortage of affordable housing, especially of affordable housing meeting high housing quality standards. And that reality alone makes preservation important. Some studies suggest that it is often, but not always, cheaper to preserve existing housing than develop new units, which means preservation efforts could sometimes be a more efficient way to ensure a set of pool of affordable housing. Further, this presents an opportunity to leverage federal resources that would be lost otherwise. Another reason for preservation is access. It is difficult to build new affordable and/or subsidized housing units in high-cost areas. My own research with Dr. Jacqueline Begley, focusing on New York City, shows that owners often exit subsidized housing programs in areas with high price appreciation, which means the areas becoming less affordable are the ones where owners often opt out of the renewal of their subsidy contracts. In work with Dr. Michael Lenz, we show that such expirations present a challenging landscape nationally for preserving access to neighborhoods that have lower poverty rates, better performing schools, and other local amenities important for child development and household economic and physical well-being. A third clear reason for preservation is that losses of these units present a real cost to low-income households who live in the properties. In theory, tenants in properties with an expiring Section 8 contract have access to a powerful form of support, which is a tenant protection voucher, a safety net that exists in no other affordable housing program. This means that when a project-based Section 8 contract ends, tenants are offered a Section 8 voucher that they can use to lease their existing unit or find a new one on the private market. But in reality, this safety net has many holes. My research with Ben Winter focused on whether households offered a tenant protection voucher use the subsidy. We found that the voucher is not used by most households, despite desire to use it and a high level of household demand for the subsidy. There is extensive research showing the many challenges households face when trying to use their voucher, not the least of which is some owners will not accept it. Those few households who use the voucher to move tend to move to lower poverty tracts. However, the subsidy offers the weakest safety net for households where the head is older than 62 or Black, as well as those with children. On average, those who do not use their voucher lose over $460 per month of rental assistance, which is equivalent to roughly 41% of their effective income. This is a huge shock to households, many of whom are low income and on fixed incomes. These numbers show that we cannot assume the existing protections work well and equally for everyone. Thus, while our focus is often on preserving the subsidy on a property, we must not forget the needs of the tenants in properties if, when, and where the subsidy is actually ended. They need support as they try to access and maintain affordable and stable housing and the many people and resources in the community that they relied on for their everyday well-being. These needs are also ongoing. My work with Greg Preston shows that households who live in subsidized housing have lower odds of being evicted than similar households in market rate properties. This means that the loss of subsidized housing has long-term implications for household stability. So what do we do? Well, in many ways, answering this question is the goal here today. I know many other panelists will present solutions, and again, I asked people to look over the many ideas put forth in the City of Philadelphia's preservation and housing plans. But again, in the interest of framing, I want to offer 3 key items. First, there needs to be an ongoing federal and local commitment to financing streams that ensure resources for preservation. Some of these resources exist already through programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program and the growing suite of local programs under current leadership. However, additional solutions could include acquisition loan funds focused on preservation and things along those lines. Resources should also extend to support tenants affected by preservation challenges through legal assistance that increases their ability to protect their rights, access to housing navigators to help them understand how to use existing protections, and a broader set of services that acknowledge their many needs, their ongoing needs. Second, there is a distinct opportunity to acknowledge that the city has a lot of regulatory authority it can use, some of which can apply to existing subsidized housing properties and to new developments to address future preservation needs. As the city has shown, combining resources and regulations is an effective approach that should be applied here in the preservation setting. And finally, there is a need to both invest in the capacity of the city to actively monitor needs and challenges, as well as support the capacity of legal service organizations, tenant organizations, and the nonprofit development community so they can meaningfully engage in proactive preservation efforts. The reality is that every moment is an important policy moment for the existing stock of subsidized housing. I hope the efforts today reflect an ongoing commitment to preservation that will result in the successful protection of much needed affordable housing in the city of Philadelphia. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Reyna. And before we move on with the testimony, I wanted to highlight one thing that you said in your testimony that was just shocking to me when I talked to you a few weeks ago, which is when we're told, that an owner is opting out, but not to worry because everyone is getting Section 8 vouchers and they'll be able to find new housing. I think you said almost half of the people who are given these vouchers are not able to successfully put them to use, and particularly if they're elderly or if they have children. So I think that's just something for us to consider as policymakers. Mr. O'Donnell, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony. You're on mute.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Vincent O'Donnell, and thank you so much for your interest in the critical issue of preserving affordable housing and for the opportunity to testify today. You're going to note a lot of unplanned redundancy of my testimony with Professor Reynas. Very important framing statement, which I wholly endorse. I would like to thank you, Councilmember Gautier, and the other co-sponsors for your leadership in focusing attention on the issue of expiring federal subsidies and use restrictions in multifamily housing. I'm currently a private affordable housing consultant who's worked for over 45 years with state and local government, nonprofit developers, resident organizations. I was formerly Vice President for Preservation at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, and I currently advise the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the City of Boston in their affordable housing preservation strategies. My primary mission personally is to promote the creation and preservation of safe, affordable multifamily housing. I also work closely with HUD at the local and headquarters leadership level on issues specifically related to assisted multifamily housing preservation. So this nation relies on the private sector to produce hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing using a wide variety of mechanisms. However, the commitments and obligations between the federal government and private owners are not permanent. Funding and regulatory control form a quid pro quo, and these business agreements have finite terms. This means that owners of subsidized multifamily housing may have the legal right and a financial incentive to discontinue receiving financial assistance, deregulate the housing, and return it to market level rents. Actual market conditions will influence an owner's decision, but continuation of affordability will at some point require an affirmative decision by an owner. The challenge is how to influence that decision in the direction of preservation. Each program's affordability mechanism has a corresponding risk. In the late 1970s, a mandate for a high level of rapid production led to a wave of HUD foreclosures, with no mandate for restoring failed properties to affordable use. Subsidized mortgages could be prepaid, terminating affordability requirements. At mortgage maturity, regulatory agreements simply expired. Long-term project-based Section 8 contracts expire. The low-income housing tax credit program requires a minimum 15-year extended use agreement after an initial 15-year compliance period, but there are loopholes, just as properties are approaching the end of that regulatory period. Also, this inventory includes properties that were built or renovated 30 to 50 years ago. Virtually all need major capital investment for sustainability. For many, prudent asset management, refinancing, and new capital or rent subsidies are enough, but some have fallen into distress and are in danger of failure. In these, a change of ownership may be needed. We need incentives for owners either to improve their performance or transfer the property to a preservation purchaser committed to permanent affordability and quality housing. Through coordinated national advocacy, we have developed a preservation toolkit that meets these challenges. It's complicated, it relies on financial incentives that are intended to make preservation the easy door, and owners are at some point in time still free to choose a different path. And as our efforts to heal distressed communities begin to succeed, rising values may make the market rate path more attractive. Ultimately, both regulation and resources are required for sustainability of this valuable portfolio. If we don't preserve it, it's more costly to replace it. Because this inventory was created primarily with federal funding under federal rules that permitted deregulation at some point in time, I believe the financial burden of the solution should primarily be the federal government's. Yet, there is also an essential role for state and local government. Data collection and analysis to which properties are at risk. Capacity building and technical assistance to preservation entities to unlock the complex preservation toolkit. Regulatory actions to require notice of pending deregulation or to grant a right of first refusal or an option or a right of first offer to a preservation entity. Interagency coordination, cultivation of a preservation mission in the housing community, and development subsidies such as soft loans and tax credits. Nonprofit purchasers see starkly that patient capital is lined up to support all cash, no due diligence purchases at irrational prices. The return on equity will come when an inevitably rising market makes it feasible to displace tenants and convert to conventional use. We can only hope that in the meantime, the unsustainable economics don't threaten the habitability of the housing itself. The economic pressure to deregulate upends conventional wisdom. We've seen low-income African-American seniors displaced from a weak market Section 8 property for conversion to luxury apartments for young professionals. Low-income housing tax credit assisted properties are routinely marketed as a, quote, significant value add opportunity, unquote, based on exploiting the extended use agreement loophole I mentioned earlier. The market is efficient and structured to reap these opportunities when and where they appear, regardless of the negative impact on racial equity. I've addressed the general shape of the preservation challenge. Andrew Frischkopf's testimony more specifically later will quantify the dimensions of the potential threats to Philadelphia's inventory of subsidized multifamily housing, as you have, Chair Gautier. I recommend taking his analysis to heart. Nationally, I find that not only in overheated markets, but also in relatively weak submarkets, there are holes in the safety net that will be exploited, reducing the affordable housing stock, harming the residents and communities the housing is serving. I commend LISC and all the members of Philadelphia's Preservation Network for their foresight and for organizing a community-based collaboration to sustain this essential community resource. The written testimony includes a somewhat more detailed and technical summary of the issues I've been describing, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Donnell, for your testimony and also for your work. I strongly agree with you that we need the federal government to step in here to help us with this federal program. I also want my colleagues and the public to know that we invited officials from HUD and PHFA several times to attend, and they declined to participate. And so I hope that this is a conversation that we can have together because it's such a critical one for the city of Philadelphia. Ms. Melissa Long, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Melissa Long. I'm the director of the city's Division of Housing and Community Development, and I'm pleased to provide testimony today on bill number 211029. And many apologies that I did not submit written testimony, but I'm happy to testify. So thank you for the opportunity. My partners, Vincent Reyna and the Preservation Network, have laid out the many challenges that we're facing, and I just has been great working with the partners and working with LISC and Vincent on the creation of the city's housing action plan, which has several recommendations to address this very critical need. I'm pleased to report that, and really emphasize that the city is absolutely committed to the greatest extent possible to providing programs and resources to help address this problem, and I'll highlight a few. But would also want to say we absolutely do need leveraged resources from the state and federal government. The city cannot do it alone, and our partners need that support as well. So I'm pleased to say that over the last several years, the city has issued a request preservation RFP. And I think it's really important for not only those that are at their 15 years, but we recognize that projects need capital investment several years into before it becomes an issue. So we are committed and have been over the last several years issuing preservation RFP to provide resources. And we just actually, in the recent one, awarded 9 projects for about almost $23 million worth of subsidy. So that is incredibly critical. We're also working with our partners, PHDC, to sort of retool a small landlord investment program. Because in addition to the Housing Action Plan, the city worked with partners on a study of the naturally occurring affordable housing. As we all know, the majority of landlords in Philadelphia are small landlords. And so also working to implement the recommendations that align with the city's Housing Action Plan. And again, I think, continue to work with our partners, council and LISC at a right of first refusal, but, also recognizing that not just city resources will be necessary to be made available to have to have that regulatory strategy work. I think it's also very important that in addition to capital improvements for these projects, that we think about the operating subsidy and rent support. And again, we continue to advocate at the national level of the need for increased vouchers and sustainable rental assistance for those that may not need that deep of subsidy. I think, while we had almost $250 million of emergency rental assistance. Those funds are expended, and we still have 30,000 tenants and landlords that had submitted rental applications requiring nearly $400 million of support. So the need for rental assistance and housing vouchers is very significant. And the city did 3 years ago, recognizing that many tenants in low-income housing tax credit financed developments are rent burdened, and working again with our partners and with over $2 million a year in housing trust funds, launched a shallow rent program to assist tenants who are rent burdened in those projects. And for a very long-standing period, utility assistance. We have had a program financed with housing trust funds to provide utility assistance for renters. So, and I think to the data piece, I know that my staff is working with city council staff on creating a database, so and working with LISC on that as well. So there are many things that we are committed to in the long term. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony.
Thank you so much, Ms. Long. Moving on to some questions. Vince Reyna and Vince O'Donnell, thank you both for being here today and for bringing your decades of experience to this hearing. Both of your testimonies highlight that this isn't a new problem and that it requires proactive coordination and participation from a variety of sectors. Which pieces of this puzzle do you feel are most important for Philadelphia to be focusing on right now as we look to extending the life of these affordable housing sites? I'd like you both to weigh in on that.
You want to go first, Mr. Shai? Okay. Well, I think it's the federal resources can be there if properly orchestrated, and so I think part of the what's important is to have a strategy that is a practical alternative for a given owner. We don't have a coercive situation and regulation process. It is based on incentives, and so I think what the city can do is to nurture and encourage purchasers who are willing to step up and make an offer to an owner that is economically comparable to what the owner's opportunity is. The other thing is, in Massachusetts, we have a state statute that creates a right of first offer and a right of first refusal for the state that's assignable to other designees. And we went through a process to create that legislation, which was essentially a consensus in the development community. And it was remarkable that we developed that consensus, and as a result, this legislation, it turns out to create what I was referring to before as an easy door. It's much simpler to do a preservation transaction because of the regulatory burden kind of falls away for a transaction which is going to maintain the affordability. So I think the city can help to create an atmosphere and help to create a consensus within the development community, and also to build the capacity of nonprofit and other purchasers who are committed to permanent affordability. It also doesn't rule out gap money. At the end of the day, there will be certain gap resources, and the city has the ability to guide the application of those gap resources.
Okay, so finding responsible buyers committed to affordability and instituting some kind of right of first refusal. I do remember that was a conversation that was started. Do you remember the challenges with that particular conversation, the right of first refusal locally?
Well, this was something which for over 10 years, maybe 15 years, was an annual ritual with the state legislature, because we have home rule issues in Massachusetts, so this legislation had to come from the state, not from the city. Or we could have gotten it by requesting home rule permission. But in any event, it was a real estate community-wide discussion, and every year these proposals were basically shot down by the real estate development community until we had a couple of crises. We lost some really important properties that were highly visible. A lot of tenants got hurt, and finally, folks in the state legislature decided that they really needed to do something, and they asked our statewide advocacy organization, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, of which I was a board member, to convene a task force to come up with a solution that everybody could support, not just live with, but support. And we just had at it for about a year and came up with something which the advocates had to recognize that we couldn't coerce, we couldn't require an owner to take less than market value for their property. We couldn't even require the owner to sell. But we maximized the opportunity where there was the ability. So if an owner decided to sell, then we could step in with a right of first refusal. We had to offer the same terms in terms of a purchase, and that meant that somebody had to back that up. You know, as one person said at the beginning of that discussion, when it was kind of confrontational, well, if the state wants to do something, they already have the power. They can declare, they can use eminent domain powers, and they can, buy the property. And that was not a constructive way to go. Everybody recognized that. And so we felt that we had to develop a kind of a consensus approach. Again, making preservation the easy door, and also the state begins to recognize that when they allocate new resources. If a player has been removing properties from affordability, there's going to be a recognition of that in the allocation of new affordable housing resources.
Thank you. Mr. Reyna, can you weigh in on what the city should be most focused on right now with respect to this issue?
Yeah, so I don't want to add too much. It's always hard to follow Vince. He was at one point my boss, and so I clearly learned from him. But I guess a couple things I just want to add to that is that clearly there's a lot of momentum going on with University City Townhomes around kind of building critical connections. And I think acknowledging that that's a moment where there is capacity building going on, but also there is a distinct statement about where capacity gaps are. And so this current moment is a real important learning opportunity for not just how you approach this one development, but how you approach them going forward. One of the things that's come up here is clearly this is a repeat game, right? So an owner can renew a contract 5 times and then not renew it, right? They can renew it in perpetuity. Each time presents an opportunity for an owner to essentially assess their needs, but potentially leverage their position as well. And so I think in some ways what you're doing here also is setting a precedent for how the city wants to respond in this context. And the response really comes across a broad set of things, right? One is public statements, right? Another is kind of supporting the capacity and collaboration of groups working on this. Another is kind of being out there with the data and realities about it and proposing legislation around it. Another is making critical links, like Vince said, about, what are the consequences? So clearly these are market transactions. This is the system we've set up, but we can acknowledge that then this might affect future decisions around resources. And so I think really acknowledging that what's going on right now in this moment really sets a lot of foundation for how the city responds in this setting, which also then sets the foundation for what owners can and may expect going forward when given the option to either renew their subsidy or exit a contract. And I think that's really a critical point. Of course, you could course correct, but I think as much as you could kind of show consistency and thoughtfulness about what those points are, the more assurance it gives the market, but also the more leverage it gives you for not having to constantly be negotiating off of something that went wrong in the past.
Thank you so much. I also think that the townhomes presents a unique moment in time to figure out how we can, not only get a good outcome now, but do this in the right way going forward. Ms. Long, would you be able to talk to us more about how the city works to forecast and anticipate affordable housing sites that are at risk of expiring? You're muted.
Sorry. Right. In the past, we have worked with LISC and we develop data from PHFA for those that had received city subsidy that would highlight, give us some information on those that how many may be at risk. And again, through our request for proposals and providing critical subsidy to projects, though at those close to the end, but more importantly, also recognizing those that need support long before that. And I think my staff, I know, is working with city council staff on developing a database so that we have more accurate information and can come up with some proactive strategies. So I know working again with LISC in that, I think will be incredibly helpful.
Okay. So I know that we're all grateful for the council president's leadership on the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative, and that this will offer more resources for affordable housing development and preservation. Does DHCD have a sense of how many preservation grants it will now be able to offer thanks to new funding that is coming from MPI, and how that compares to the number of buildings whose affordability contracts are at risk of expiring in a given year?
And I think we're getting a good sense of that, and we're continuing to forecast that out. But with the recent proposal that we issued over this past fall, 9 projects with almost $23 million in subsidy, a majority of that. Thank you, Council President, City Council, and the administration for these NPI dollars. We would look to be able to hopefully issue another preservation RFP this summer, and I can get back to you with some more projections over the 4 years of NPI.
Okay. You talked earlier about the city's housing action plan from 2018 and how it identified affordable housing rental preservation as a key area of need. Are there any specific recommendations from that plan that you feel are of primary importance for the city to focus on and implement at this time related to this issue?
And I think one, especially let's not forget the small landlords, right? So I do believe that, we had identified a capital support for small landlords. And I know we are working with PHDC and their staff on implementing that program. That's going to be incredibly critical. I believe we also talked about shallow rent. And we were able to launch that 3 years ago. And we did recognize the importance of right of first refusal, and are committed to working with council and partners on that as well.
Okay. If you had
also I will add, yep, because I think it is important, because I'm looking at Vincent, right? We do need to continue to advocate at that federal level, right? Because I think what's very critically important and really recognize and that even low-income housing tax credits with rents at less than 60%, and many of our tenants are cost burden or severely cost burden, and in desperate need of, ongoing flexible feds. I'm going to say this, my friends from HUD listening, flexible funding for rental assistance, and of course increased housing vouchers, because that's in order to ensure that our very, very low income residents can remain in those tax credit units that are preserved or newly produced, right? One of the biggest challenges that we have, and in naturally occurring affordable housing, is definitely rental assistance.
Okay, so we've all, I think everyone on this panel and myself, we've all talked about how we critically need HUD to step in here. Does the city have what steps have we taken, or what steps have we thought of to meaningfully engage HUD as well as PHFA in this conversation, given what we know can happen in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think, we work with the mayor's administration, working with HUD, and I can tell you, as you can imagine, that I also advocate tirelessly at our regional level, and in the hopes, because a lot of that is around, right, it's one thing to the increased allocation to the extent money does, in our world, in CDBG and home, that those dollars are flexible and that we can indeed use them, right? So and we will continue to do that, and we always encourage our partners to advocate as well.
Okay. Remind me, I heard you say that we were working on a list of where all of these properties are in the city and when they're expiring. Does that mean that we do not currently have a list?
We worked with LISC, and we do have that list, but I think, and I can get back to you on some more details of what is actually being programmed, but I think it's a more robust program and database of property. So I can definitely get back to you with more details on that.
Okay. If you had all the staffing resources you needed, how could you envision the city playing a more proactive role in preventing opt-outs and getting housing providers with resources to keep buildings in good condition, and just be more, I guess, sort of engaged with this issue?
I think in being strategic about it, because again, recognizing the city has limited resources, and especially being now 2 years into the pandemic. And I think it's, again, and we have great partners, is increasing our, calling on partners, right, to help. And we have in the past, LISC and PACDC to, we recognize that there absolutely is a need for capacity building, or for some of our nonprofits many years ago that got into it and no longer want to be in that business, to sort of help with partnering with experienced developers. So I think it's, continuing to work with our network of partners and data. And it's not so much in we're not in an environment where we have unlimited resources, and we want as many to absolutely go into the communities and into the projects that we need. So really working to rely on partners.
Okay, but I would hope we're also, yes, we are a city with constrained resources, and this will take resources, but there are costs to thousands of people losing their housing on all sorts of city systems.
I totally hear you. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that Councilmember Gilmore Richardson has a question. Councilmember, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for this hearing and for the important information that's been shared, particularly with this first panel. I've been I have about a page or two already of copious notes around all the information that's been shared. But I wanted to go back to Melissa's testimony, where she talked about naturally occurring affordable housing stock here in the city of Philadelphia. And I wanted to just get a few things on the record around our naturally occurring affordable housing stock. And you asked one of the questions already relative to sort of mapping out where this affordable housing is, particularly with those that have expiring situations, like the situation with University City townhomes. So, Melissa, I just wanted to ask if the city is tracking data around our naturally occurring affordable housing stock, and how it has changed since the pandemic. And if you all could break that down between like single family homes, or those that are like, 1 to 4 units, like a duplex or a triplex, quadplex, and then high rises or larger affordable housing units.
Yes, I can loop back with my staff on that and see and get back to you with what we have and from that came out of our study. Yep.
Okay, that'll be great, because what I really want to do is understand, particularly for the record and for council members' understanding, is what is happening with our naturally occurring affordable housing since the pandemic. And where, if we could sort of map it out, where the most constraints are, so that we understand where the most resources are needed and how we should prioritize those resources for individuals. And I think we can't manage what we don't measure. So we really need to understand what is happening, particularly with, you talked about the small landlord community. You talked about how, affordable housing rental preservation needs to occur in the city. So we need to figure out how we do that, because we know that there are constraints on the system and just on constituents in general who are struggling to stay in the city. And I think we've seen that most recently with our census results, and how some of the collar counties have picked up population, and how population has even shifted within the city, going from downtown, Northern Liberties, Brewerytown, pushing up into the Northwest and some of the other areas, and just how the housing stock has just changed in general. So I think we really need to get a really robust picture of exactly what's happening now that we have the census results and then what's going on through the pandemic. So we understand where we have to put resources for individuals and for families to try to help them preserve and, stay in the naturally occurring affordable housing that they're currently in. Okay, so I think we really need that information.
Okay, yes, absolutely. And I also think, during the pandemic, and I remember having a conversation with HUD, especially with small landlords, right, where we had a very small allocation of, it was $11 million of community development block grant, CARES Act money, right? And for the small landlords, I can remember having a conversation. Do we have any, especially those smaller ones that were not able to pay their mortgage, programs to help the landlord, right? And they're not thought of as a small business. So, not receiving rent from tenants because of lack of rental assistance, has this, that I don't have any data, but we know that, those owning 1 and 2 or 3 units were also very significantly impacted, right? Because their tenants were not able to pay rent, and there were no other programs, to help them. So, yeah, we'll work on getting you that information. Thanks.
Okay, that'll be great. And we thank you all for the work that you've been doing, even around the tangled title piece, which, I know that's separate from this hearing, but it's also a part of home ownership preservation in the city and keeping folks in their naturally occurring affordable housing for families. The last thing I wanted to talk about is how we all are thinking about the infrastructure package and the possibility of sort of applying for competitive federal dollars to help some of the owners of the naturally occurring affordable housing in the city to maintain that housing and have additional federal support outside of like a rent subsidy or a shallow rent subsidy to help them with the maintenance and preservation of the homes. Because one thing I think we've heard a lot about is the condition of the housing stock, and that the housing stock is older here in the city, which I think plays into some of the other things we're seeing happening across the city. So how are we looking at the bipartisan infrastructure package as an opportunity to try to get some additional competitive dollars in for the owners?
I think with the final infrastructure package was passed, I would need to go back, and I think that there is not as much opportunity for rental assistance or housing that ended up coming in that final bill at that level. So again, I would definitely want to get back to you on that as well.
Okay,
I know that it was in the original, right?
Yeah. But you know what, Melissa, I was thinking more so around not just the sort of rent subsidies, but more so around opportunities for, let's say, weatherization upgrades in a property, other environmental aspects that we could potentially, do competitive funding for if the city would apply, for that particular funding. So looking at opportunities for unique funding opportunities outside of the rent subsidies that may or may not be available.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity is going to be in the Build Back Better bill, right? That I think is not the infrastructure bill. And I think the Build Back Better bill is currently stalled. So we can advocate for that one to get passed. But I think the housing related weatherization capital improvements, I think are that's more in the Build Back Better bill.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we are thinking about all of the potential opportunities that may abound with some of the dollars we know that are sort of one-time infusions for cities to provide help in any way we can for our housing stock, particularly for an older city like Philadelphia. So I was just simply trying to think outside the box to figure out what more can we do in order to try to make a difference for our constituents. So thank you very much, Melissa, and to the whole team over at Planning. We really appreciate the work that you do. And thank you so much, Madam Chair, for this hearing.
Thank you, Council Member. Are there additional questions or comments from members of the committee? Okay. There being none, Ms. Sherrills, will you please call the next panel to testify?
Miss Ida Smith, Rashida Alexander, and Rachel Garland.
Ms. Smith, are you there and connected?
Yes, I'm here.
Please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Good morning, council members. My name is Aida Smith, a soon-to-be displaced resident of University City Townhomes, and I'm here today to give testimony on the impact of being forced to leave the only home and community I have ever known for almost 40 years. Most of the information that I've heard today is basically what I tried to encapsulate in my thought patterns and write down. Mr. O'Donnell and Mr. Vernier had said a few things that caught my attention, and that is why the city or federal government know about these contracts expiring, but yet and still they do nothing about them. Where they could do, you talked about these, what do you call them, opt-ins or opt-outs. You were talking about that, but yet and still no one has approached these owners before ahead of time to say, okay, this is getting ready to happen. Your contract is about to expire. What are you going to do? So if you decide to sell, are you going to give the renters or the tenants an opportunity maybe to buy into the property, and or the city the opportunity to have first crack at buying or bidding on certain properties? I don't understand how this can go this far. I was going to give a whole bunch of information, which I think I will, because it's really irritating me to sit here and listen to all of this spiel about the things you can do when it's not that complicated. All it does is take willpower to do it. These programs have been in play from the information that I've gotten since the 1930s and stuff. Black people weren't involved in that. So now all of a sudden, as Black people, we don't have enough money or housing for Black people, Black and brown people, when in reality, we know there's more white people in this country than there are Blacks. But it always seems to come down to the other of where we don't have enough housing, affordable housing. Okay, now I'll get into what I wanted to say, basically. Excuse me. I'm going to start again. My name is Aida Smith, soon to be displaced resident of UCTH, and I'm here today to give testimony on the impact of being forced to leave the only home and community I've known for almost 40 years. Through no fault of my own, but through and for the sake of making a hefty profit by selling off said properties and the displacement of the working poor and most vulnerable to make a sizable profit. I've lived and worked, played and raised a family in this neighborhood since March of 1983. That's why it was somewhat of a surprise after years of denying that the townhouses wouldn't go up for sale. It caught everyone off guard when doing a community meeting hosted by Altman and Co., announcing that they, Altman, will not be renewing the contract with HUD's Section 8 program. That meeting took place on July 8th, 2021, with the expectations that all tenants are expected to be out by July 8th, 2022. Although we are still in the midst of a raging pandemic, Altman is still in the process of selling UCTH to the highest bidder, if it hasn't already sold as we speak. Every day we get closer to the deadline, and anxiety fills me with the worry of where I'm going to find affordable, clean, safe housing that's in a desirable community that's close to and within walking distance to doctors' offices, hospitals, schools, restaurants, and markets, etc., with public transportation feet away from my doorstep. Hoping to find a community, a community that's the same as where we live now, with the same amenities, with little disruption to moving into a new community. That's what makes UCTH such a desirable place to live. We have to leave so gentrification can take place. Suburbanites want back into the city. As the pressure grows for new money to come back to the city, there has been a concerted effort to push low income workers and the vulnerable, meaning people of color, to the outskirts of the city, where rents will be substantially lower, making it easier to live outside the city and harder to get back into the city. Whereas higher income renters will pay a high premium for prices to live in the that they can afford and live inside and work inside of the city. With all this being said, there are questions that needs to be asked of our elected officials, and it has to do with: why aren't cities, municipalities, and states bidding on these properties, especially when local and state governments know exactly when most contracts are about to expire? When knowing there are shortages of affordable housings throughout the city and country, why are these property owners given contracts that benefit them in the long term, but the low income and vulnerable are left to twist in the wind? There should be clauses in these contracts that when property owners decide to opt out, that the city and or community has the first opportunity to bid for the said property at reasonable prices. As you all know, right now in University City, there is a building boom going on in our area. But none of these new apartments or residential homes will be available to the average worker in the area or low income person. All of the building is slated for students and higher income earners. This is also where government should be stepping in to get developers to build more affordable houses by taking or holding back on tax credits if developers don't set aside or build more affordable housings across the city, instead of marginalizing the working poor to appease a certain group of a certain class or group of people. create more mixed income neighborhoods. Being that Philadelphia is one of the most segregated cities in America, we can change this if we have the willpower to change and the work to make a better city and country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Smith, for sharing your personal story that is going on right now, and that I can't even imagine how stressful and painful it is. So we thank you, and thank you also for highlighting rightly that this is partly a policy failure on many levels of government. And I just want to reiterate that that I stand with you all and am committed to getting as good and as just an outcome as we can at the townhomes, and also to doing what I can from my position and with my colleagues to prevent this from happening again. Thank you so much for your testimony. Let's see. Ms. Alexander, are you there and connected?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm
Can you
connected.
please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony?
My name is Rashida Alexander. I am a current resident of University City Townhomes. I also am an employee of Project Home. And my testimony, I just wanted to say thank you for even inviting me. But this is my testimony. Good day. My name is Rashida Alexander. I am a resident of University City Townhomes. I moved into townhomes directly after I moved out of the shelter in my home in 2008, which was 13 years ago. When I first moved into townhomes, they had a community center for the residents' use. Then management closed down the community room. Years later, the community room went under renovation. The property management expanded the leasing office. Then they put a small resource center there for the residents' use, which helped those who were searching for employment or needed computers for school. Our children had schools to go to, such as Drew Elementary School and University City High School, recreation centers such as POW, who poured into our children, into the community, as well as volunteers from Drexel and Penn, who would become mentors for the children of our neighborhood. The volunteers would take the children to the movies, the libraries, and would take these children on walks. They created bonds with our children, and it gave these children, who is our future, something to look forward to. It was less tension because the children had outlets to be children. All of this, which has been taken away from us to appease the agenda of University of Penn, not only with their expansion, they thought of our children, they thought of our children by tearing down the schools to make parking lots for cars. So their cars were more important than our children's future, as well as luxury living spaces for their students. Then the students stopped coming around and the resource center was taken away. One by one, our amenities were stripped from us. University City Townhomes is one of few places left that accommodate those working class families who make too much to get assistance from the government, but does not make enough to be able to live comfortably, without wondering where our next meal will be coming from. Affordable housing was designed to assist those who not only fall in this category, but for those who are also on fixed income. And in their reality, they would be homeless because the new homes and apartments that they have built are starting at $1,800 a month. If I work a full-time job and cannot afford that kind of rent, what makes you think someone who depends on the government can afford market rate rent? You all know that cutting back on federal funding for affordable housing makes no sense. People have become displaced and forced into homelessness because they lost their affordable housing through gentrification and consistent defunding. How much more are y'all going to take? Why are the working class citizens and those on fixed incomes being pushed out. We want more affordable housing, not less. Affordable housing gives those who may not be able to pay market rent a chance to still have a home to raise their children and grandchildren. As the words of Project Home says, none of us are home until all of us are home. This means no one with true concern for human beings will be comfortable having and living in their home, knowing that their neighbor does not have a home. Taking funding is taking homes away from people. How can one be successful if they're worrying about shelter? The government put finances everywhere but where they need to be putting finances. Stop treating us like pawns and not people. We deserve better. And those who are taking the funding should be ashamed of themselves. Give us an opportunity. Give the residents an opportunity to buy their own buildings. Therefore, we can become homeowners and form a fund to help residents by funding. And form a fund to help residents buy buildings. Give training so residents can form associations and run their own buildings. Also, can we have um, associations or classes to help those who don't have good credit scores? They never gave us a chance to be homeowners. They never gave us a chance to even be a buyer in the market. They just disregarded us. And my issue is, and I explained this over numerous times. I work with the homeless. I work for Project Home, and formerly for Resources for Human Development. So I see both sides of it. I don't just see the homeless side. As I've been homeless, I also see the side where I see people get vouchers and they can't even get adequate housing because it's nowhere for them to go. And then for them to know or not even care, it's like y'all told us that we had to get out in July of 2021. Yet we still haven't even received any Section 8 vouchers. They said that they would give us vouchers in March or April. That's not enough time. Anyone who's ever purchased a home or looked for a home in any aspect of the word know that it takes more than 2 and 3 months to find a home. You want us out by July, but you're giving us vouchers in March and April. Not only are you displacing us, but you're putting us in a position to be homeless with our children. And we don't deserve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alexander. Thank you for sharing your story in the midst of something that's very painful that's happening to you. Thank you for talking about the injustice that this presents to the residents of the townhomes. And thank you for highlighting what I think are reasonable requests on how people should be treated. Thank you, too, for your critical work at Project Home. Ms. Garland, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to address the committee in support of resolution number 211029. My name is Rachel Garland, and I'm the managing attorney of the housing unit at Community Legal Services. About a dozen years ago, 16 families living in Society Hill came to Community Legal Services for help. Many of them were elderly Black matriarchs of families who had grown up for generations in Society Hill, or they all went to school at McCall, and many of them went on to teach or work as crossing guards at McCall and worship at Mother Bethel, the first AME church across the street. The owner of their subsidized property had chosen to do what is known as opting out by ending the subsidy contract and was asking them all to move so that he could break up their units and sell them. And the families were distraught over needing to move and for what this process meant for their neighborhood where they had invested so much. Washington Square East was one of the last sources of affordable housing in Society Hill, and even though the tenants would be given vouchers to subsidize their moves, they had no chance of being able to afford rents anywhere near their homes, even with a voucher subsidy. Unfortunately, by the time Community Legal Services learned of this opt-out, there was little that could be done legally other than to help the tenants understand the process of moving with their vouchers. Then again in 2017, Overmont House opted out of their subsidy contract, forcing the households to relocate from their homes of 40 years. It was these experiences that prompted Community Legal Services to work with Temple Law School's Scheller Center for Social Justice in 2017 to produce the Danger of the Opt-out report. The report found that over thousands of Philadelphia families living in subsidized housing are at risk of losing their affordable housing in the coming decade. This is because federal law allows owners of Section 8 project-based housing to opt out of preserving their properties as affordable housing. Section 8 project-based housing began in the 1960s as a way for the federal government to finance mortgages and provide subsidy contracts to providers of affordable housing. What makes project-based housing unique is that the subsidy is tied to a particular building or a set of buildings in a particular neighborhood. For generations, as tenants move in or out, the property continues to act as a source of affordable housing in that particular neighborhood. The issue is that these project-based properties are privately owned, and therefore when the subsidy contract comes to an end, it's the owner's choice whether or not to renew the contract. If an owner chooses to opt out, they can turn the units into private market-rate apartments, they can sell it for commercial use, they can demolish the property, and there are often significant economic incentives for owners to opt out and eliminate these affordable housing units, which are often in gentrifying neighborhoods. Once an owner has opted out, the source of affordable housing ends and cannot be reinstated at a later date. Congress stopped allocating funding for Section 8 project-based housing assistance payments contracts over 40 years ago. Danger of the Opt-out report looked at all of Philadelphia's project-based properties using a number of risk factors. At the time, 44 of the properties were owned by for-profit companies, who therefore have an increased incentive to opt out of Section 8 contracts if it's more profitable to do so. 18 of the properties were in gentrifying census tracts, and 24 of the properties had inspection scores of 89 or lower, putting them at increased risk of opt-out to avoid negative consequences by HUD. At least 16 properties in Philadelphia met 2 out of these 3 risk factors. And unfortunately, like many components of affordable housing, this risk of opt-outs disproportionately affects Philadelphians who are low-income and Black. Philadelphia is currently going through the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing process, as it last did in 2016. The resulting assessment of fair housing document found that at the time, African American tenants lived in project-based housing in disproportionately large numbers. 65% of residents compared with 44% of the city's population. Data showed that African American tenants in Philadelphia were also disproportionately likely to carry a severe housing cost burden, a HUD measure based on a resident paying 50% or more of their income to housing costs. The loss of any affordable housing, and particularly the loss of Section 8 project-based housing, is hardest felt by Black and Brown populations, already facing severe housing challenges. Not only are these tenants forced to move out of the home they have lived in for years, often decades, they most often can no longer remain in their neighborhoods and struggle to find replacement housing in other, far less economically advantageous areas of the city. The preservation of Section 8 project-based housing is a critical racial equity issue here in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, Philadelphia is continuing to see owners choosing to opt out of these project-based subsidies, forcing households to displace from their long-term homes, most recently University City townhomes in West Philly, which you've just heard from 2 tenants about how it's affecting them and their neighbors personally. There are 73 households in that property complex. In 2019, we worked with Philadelphia's Preservation Network and City Council to introduce a notice requirement that would provide advance notice beyond the minimal notice required by HUD. Thanks to that legislation, the city and Community Legal Services were able to learn of University City Townhomes' decision to opt out of their project-based contract a year in advance and begin to engage with the tenants and University City Townhomes to try to find paths to preservation of the subsidy and stability for the tenants. However, this notice requirement is insufficient. Without a right of first refusal and meaningful supports to enable a prospective buyer to step in with funding to purchase these properties when the owners want to end the subsidy or sell the property, Philadelphia will continue to lose affordable housing resources that are tied to particular neighborhoods. Community Legal Services is committed to continuing to work with Philadelphia's Preservation Network, the city and city council to explore and advocate for preservation initiatives, many of which are being described here today, by Rashida Phillips, Dina Schlossberg, and Andrew Fishkoff, as well as others presenting testimony. I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee in support of this important issue. Thank you to Councilmember Gautier for your resolution and dedication to exploring the effects of opt-outs and possible paths to preservation of affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Garland. Words can't express how grateful we are for the advocacy and support of community legal services and the great amount of support that you provide to residents who are going through this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My question is for Ms. Smith and Ms. Alexander, if you're still on. You got into this in your testimony, but since we have many government officials and representatives here in the hearing today, I wanted to know what would be your top ask of us to ensure that these opt-outs don't continue happening in Philadelphia every year.
You want to go first, Rashida, or do you want me to go?
You can go.
I think the bill that you tried to get passed or got passed is a step towards helping to keep owners from selling right from under, to putting tenants directly out on the street. But I think it could be more done, as far as giving tenants or I don't know, there's some funding that I've heard about that where the tenants could buy up the properties and become, as Rashida was saying, take care of the properties ourselves and make sure that nobody is homeless. There's so many things that can be done. It's easy and simple. I think making it more accessible or more mixed incomes, then you wouldn't have places ready to close down or owners ready to close certain places down because it's not the desirable type of people that they want in the area because the area is changing. So there are things that can be done. I know Altman hasn't changed his mind. He probably sold the building, and this is just a formality because I don't see anything stopping Altman from selling this property. So we'll still be out on the street. And as it's been brought up, where are we going to go when most people are getting these vouchers leaked?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, and then there's all of this building around us, all this new building around us, but yet and still nothing is allocated for low income. It's all for students and faculty. So some of that could have been, development in this area should have been brought up with city council when they're giving out these permits to developers to say, oh, wait, what are you doing for low income or the most vulnerable in the neighborhoods? What are you building?
Thank you. So not only more, and more appropriate notice, but support to tenants so that you all can own the homes, the places that you've been calling home.
Yes.
Ms. Alexander, how would you answer that question? What would you want to see from your government to make sure that this doesn't happen in the future?
I would like to see more of a fight. I really believe it is being addressed, but it's in a passive way to not be so confrontational. But I don't feel like the council members are fighting enough for us. I don't feel like the government is fighting enough for us. We're just disregarded. It's no way that we had no contact. I mean, I know that you have personally came out and spoken with us, but a lot of these people that we voted for, they're not even reaching out to us. They're not even supporting or standing with us. And I think that it has to go further than just just meeting. Like, come out and support with us. Like, show us that y'all care. Because yeah, words are being, you're saying you care and we're having these meetings, but it's an action word for me. Like, I need to see action. That's how I feel about it.
No, thank you so much. You want to see us fight for you guys, and I agree. You deserve that. So thank you. Councilmember Jones, do you have questions or comments?
I'm not as fast with the mute button as I should be. But first and foremost, thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing this hearing to council. And I couldn't help but see you visibly moved by the testimony here today. I know stereotypically the gentrification, affordable housing issue gets lumped in with the second and the fifth and the third district primarily, but I want you to know that it's hitting the fourth district as well. Whether you talk about the Pavilion, Briff Shalom, or the Penn Wynn building, it 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 hits us as well. I don't want to call it a borderline, but the block that I grew up on as a kid, 58th and Filbert, I was looking on Zillow and how much they're wanting for starter homes that have been renovated there. And I can't help but think about how some of my kids can't afford to live on the block I grew up on. So what I want to talk about a little bit, or asked about, Madam Chair, is in cases like Briff Shalom, Penn Wynn, they've got a lot of funding, maybe in the 70s. And a lot of those terms and conditions, HUD agreements, have now expired. And so a lot of the folk that got in on rent subsidies of $400, $500 a month, the owners are now looking for outs. In the case of Penn Wynn, and I'm thankful, forever grateful to Turn for kind of highlighting this issue, that it's not just a South Philly, North Philly, Southwest problem, it's a citywide issue. But these people were displaced. The genesis for the whole good cause law was because of this case. And now we're seeing it spread to buildings where there are protective classes, whether you're in the military or a veteran, you get a subsidy. People with disabilities, some of them get subsidies, but they're inching them out to try to get a turnover in residents. They've used tactics, Madam Chair, like disinvestment, where they won't invest in the buildings and want the city to be forced to shut down the building so they can take on a total renovation and then a total turnover of desirable, I think the term was used, tenants, market rate tenants, changing the dynamic in whole neighborhoods. So I don't know what we should be doing with our partners at the federal level to kind of take a hard look at those kinds of covenants that are now expiring. That's number one. And then the other thing is, what is it, gross median income? Am I saying that right, Madam Chair?
Area median income.
Area median. Excuse me. But that is causing a great deal of problems, because when we work out with these developers, We give them an opportunity in distressed buildings. What then happens is that area median income is calculated on Montgomery County, Bucks County, along with Philadelphia County incomes, and people who originally got in on these deals are now being priced out of these deals. These are people with good pensions, former police officers, teachers that can't afford that rent once calculated with the area counties. So I don't know, Madam Chair, where we go with this, but it has become, particularly in my district, a increasing problem and very problematic.
Thank you, Chair Jones. I mean, yes, thank you for highlighting that this is a dire situation across the city, and for also highlighting how problematic AMI is. You know, we have many developers coming to the city wanting to deliver affordable housing at 80% of AMI. The average third district resident is at 34% of AMI. So the gap between what people can actually afford and what's being produced is huge, right? And definitely should be a concern for all of us here. I don't know if were there folks on the panel that wanted to speak to some of the issues that Councilmember Jones raised? Okay, I mean, I think that you're bringing up and just further clarifying that this is an issue across the whole city, that we have to be all in, right? It can't just be that the city is expected to figure this out on our own. We're going to need the state government, the federal government, and private entities to really be at the table, figuring out how we preserve affordable housing in our city, and also deliver more affordable housing to our residents. So thank you for those comments. If there are no additional questions or comments for this, oh, wait a second. I have a question for Ms. Garland. Sorry, I'm moving too quickly.
Okay, and Madam Chair, I ask to be recognized in the chat as well when we have time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go now.
Okay, you sure? I can defer to you if you'd like to go first, and I can go after you.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Chair. I just, was really brought to my remembrance, and I wanted to ask someone from the Department of Planning if we could include this in our data request after listening to the remarks from my district council member and colleague, Councilmember Jones. Outside of the apartment buildings that have the federal subsidies similar to University City Townhome, is there any way, or is there someone in city government, either from property to planning, L&I, or elsewhere, that's tracking the ownership movement of these apartment high-rises in the city? And I say that because of the situation that Councilmember Jones is uniquely aware of, that we're faced with in the 4th Council District, but specifically in my area. So how can we get someone in the city of Philadelphia, either in planning or in coordination with L&I, to track the ownership of all the apartment high-rises in the city? Because very rarely do we find out from either the previous owner or the owner that purchases the property that the property is under new ownership. And we need to be able to track that, particularly because once that happens, the rents increase. And we know that it's unaffordable for those living in our communities. So we do need someone in government to track the ownership of all the apartment high-rises in the city, whether they have a federal subsidy or not. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for that. It is critical. I think that our next panel, I believe, is going to talk about how we're working to have more of that data. Councilmember Green's bill that passed, I guess, about 2 years ago, does offer the opportunity for the city to have notice. I think we just have to be better about making sure that that notice is sort of widespread. And also, we need the ability to do something with the notice. I mean, I will say that I know that planning met with the owners of the university townhomes several times to see if there was anything that the city could do. We just didn't have the capacity at that time with a property that is that valuable to step in, or at least we haven't yet created the capacity for ourselves to really intervene with a property that could be as valuable as $100 million, right? And so this is going to take some substantial resources and also us having stronger policies, I think, as well as a working partnership on this issue with state and federal government. Let's see, I have a question for Ms. Garland. From all of CLS's work with Philadelphians who get caught up in these opt-outs, what recommendations do you feel are most important to support residents living in buildings where the owner intends to not renew their affordability contract?
So I think there's a number of interesting models out there. So we heard from Vincent O'Donnell and Vincent Reyna earlier about, a couple of the strategies that have been put in place elsewhere. Rashida Phillips also submitted written testimony that lays out, even in the past 2 years since the Preservation Network was originally working with City Council on the notice requirement and the possible right of first refusal. I think there's even more ideas that have come forward, especially getting to what the tenants just both spoke about, is what could be put in place to build tenant power to be able to take over properties and be realistic owners of those properties. I think there's a few models nationwide that we can look at, and I think it would really take the Preservation Network and City Council and the city thinking through how to make that a viable option here in Philadelphia, because there are some differences just in terms of costs and how we institute that. I think the right of first refusal is a good first step, right? I think the right of first offer and right of first refusal gives the opportunity to other providers of affordable housing, to the city, to other developers, to at least have the opportunity to see if this is something that they might be able to purchase. And Councilmember Gilmore Richardson and Councilmember Jones, I think some of what we've been working on has been specifically tailored to properties that already have subsidies in place, either project-based properties or low-income housing tax credit properties. But I agree with you that there's also many properties out there that don't necessarily, such as Penn that still have significant displacement effects on the tenants when that owner of the property decides to demolish the property or decides to turn it into student housing. And so there are other things that we might want to consider expanding to be able to include those properties as well. It's just in the case where there is a subsidy tied to the property, that subsidy itself is such a valuable resource for that neighborhood that we don't want to lose that, in addition to the serious concern of displacement. So I think right of first refusal is a strong first step. I don't think it's going to solve many of these problems, though, without the component of affordability. And going back to University City Townhomes, I don't know that University City Townhomes, if we'd had a right of first refusal, would have put anyone in a position to step in and purchase the property because of its location, because of what it's being marketed as, the type of purchaser that it's being marketed to. So I think the right of first refusal is a good first step, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem entirely.
Thank you. There being no other questions or comments from members for this panel, Ms. Sherrills, will you please call the next panel or witness to testify?
Andrew Frischkoff and Dina Schlossberg, and available from LISC for answering questions are Carolyn Plack and Daniel Swain.
Thank you so much. Mr. Frischkoff, I see you there. Can you please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony?
Yes, thank you very much. My name's Andrew Frischkopf. I'm the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Office of Local Initiatives Support Corporation, known as LISC. I'd like to thank you, Councilmember Gautier, for your leadership in introducing this resolution, and to all of the council members present and on the committee for your commitment to protecting and preserving affordable rental housing in the city of Philadelphia. I would like to thank all of you also who have joined and taken time today to testify on this important issue. LISC is a leading national and local community development financial institution and a community development intermediary that partners closely with community organizations to revitalize their neighborhoods. LISC served as the city's consultant in developing its 10-year housing action plan, and it currently serves as the collaborative leader of the Preservation Network, a cross-sector group of nonprofit, private, and public agencies dedicated to the preservation of at-risk, publicly assisted, affordable rental housing in Philadelphia. Let me start by applauding City Council and the administration for committing $400 million in bond proceeds over the next 4 years under the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative. A portion of these funds will play a critical role in preserving affordable housing. In addition, we congratulate the city for recently awarding funds for 9 preservation projects totaling 773 units. Unfortunately, as we've heard today, this is not enough. These are precarious times for lower income families and individuals, making the need for affordable housing development and preservation especially acute. Let me share some stark statistics. More than half of Philadelphia renters spend more than 30% of their monthly income on rent and utilities. Our city lacks nearly 72,000 affordable apartments for people with very low and low income households. Philadelphia lost nearly 24,000 market rate apartments that had rents that were $750 or less in the past 15 or more years. These are the apartments we refer to as naturally occurring affordable housing. With the disappearance of naturally occurring affordable housing, preservation of publicly assisted housing becomes increasingly crucial. Publicly assisted affordable rental housing uses federal subsidies, such as the Section 8 project-based program and the low-income housing tax credit program, to support construction and affordable rents for seniors, people with disabilities, and other people with low and moderate incomes. As we've seen most recently, publicly assisted rental housing is at risk due to expiring contracts and affordability requirements. In addition to University City townhomes, we risk losing as many as 14,000 affordable apartments in Philadelphia by 2035. This is especially troubling when we consider the publicly assisted properties that have been lost already due to inadequate preservation strategies. We've discussed some already. I just want to highlight the 220 seniors who were displaced in 2016 when the owner of Overmont House converted the property in Councilmember Jones's 4th District to student housing. The property had been subsidized through federal housing finance funding, and it provided Section 8 subsidies to seniors for 40 years. It is worth noting in the case of University City townhomes that the owner is doing what the owner of Overmont House did not, which is to work with the Department of Housing and Urban Development through a program known as 8BB to ensure that the subsidies that have currently been in place for University City townhomes can be transferred to other properties in Philadelphia. While of no solace and comfort for residents in University City townhomes, for the city to maintain these Section 8 subsidies within the city is crucially important as a preservation strategy. But while the 8BB is a useful tool, it is insufficient to address our crisis. With the shortfall of 72,000 affordable apartments in Philadelphia, as we've heard today, many University City townhome residents and other displaced people struggle to find nearby housing, may be displaced to other parts of the city, and will lose ties to a neighborhood that has been home for decades. In the case of University City townhomes, one that is rich in amenities with access to employment, education, transportation, and healthcare. It is important also to add that the University City townhomes provide 70 homes consisting of 19 two-bedroom and 51 three or more bedroom apartments. The loss of these multi-bedroom homes underscores a deeper crisis for Philadelphia's families because most new development produces apartments with fewer bedrooms. Foundation for the Future is the companion to the city's Housing Action Plan. In it, we included core recommendations and strategies to address at-risk properties and preserve essential affordable rental housing in the city. These strategies include developing new financing options and revenue streams to preserve at-risk properties, strengthening the capacity of residents, owners, and others to repair, recapitalize, and manage properties, enacting new laws and regulations to support long-term preservation of affordable rental housing, and improving available and actionable data about publicly assisted affordable rental properties. Thanks to Resolution 211029, we highlight the need of these strategies to be implemented, and with the understanding that they will be most effective if they work in concert with each other. To this end, LISC and the Preservation Network strongly support open and actionable data, been discussed earlier during Ms. Long's testimony, but City Council administration need to commit to working together to develop a publicly accessible online preservation database for at-risk rental properties. We need supportive regulations that require affordable housing developers to disclose potential sales of publicly assisted housing, or even reduction in the number of the affordable rental units within their properties, and especially if they are applying for financing for new properties that they may be developing in the city. We need supportive regulations that amend the City of Philadelphia's housing code to ensure city mortgages include the right of first refusal language and a provision that debt repayment will be directed to preserving at-risk affordable housing. While not all affordable rental housing properties have mortgages from the city, many of them do, and we need to make sure that we use this tool to our best long-term preservation strategies. And then finally, financing options and revenue streams to preserve at-risk properties. According to HUD, preserving existing affordable housing is generally much more cost-effective than new construction, by as much as 50% less expensive. With this understanding, LISC and the Preservation Network acknowledge that new resources will be essential for preserving at-risk housing. Three important funding vehicles are the debt repayment on city mortgages, funding from the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative, and also allocating the 0.5% of the city's total general fund appropriations to the Philadelphia Housing Trust Fund, as approved by voters in November of 2021. These funds, in addition to new resources that we must identify together, are necessary to lift the financial barriers that developers face when preserving properties. In addition to these recommendations, as has been discussed earlier, some Preservation Network members would like to revisit the 2019 legislation that supports preservation of affordable housing. This legislation could require a right of notice and right of first refusal on all publicly assisted affordable rental housing. LISC is available, ready, and willing to work with others on such legislation. As we know, prior to the pandemic, Philadelphia was experiencing a period of economic and population growth, and the city aspired to further Philadelphia's prosperity by helping residents stay in their homes and neighborhoods while they seek further economic opportunities. With the pandemic and the calls for racial justice and equity, Philadelphia must address the deep-rooted and systemic inequities that are a part of our nation and our city's history. Safe, decent, quality, affordable housing is foundational to building equity, justice, and opportunities for all Philadelphians. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide this testimony to you today.
You're here. You're here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Frischkopf, and thank you so much for LISC's work on the Preservation Network, not only to provide the city with data, but to really bring forward some policy recommendations that can help on this issue. I did want to correct one thing for the record. University City Townhomes includes about 16 two-bedrooms. The rest of the development is actually 3 bedrooms and 4 bedrooms. So I think it's important to note that what we're really losing is housing that is affordable to working class families in a very amenity-rich neighborhood. And what we're seeing be produced on the private market are studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and on the homeownership side, housing that not many people in this area can afford. So we are losing the ability for families to live in neighborhoods of choice, and I think that should be an important important aspect of this conversation.
Thank you.
Ms. Schlossberg, can you state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony?
Sure. Good. Hello, everybody. I'm Dina Schlossberg, and well, I'm going to start with my testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am Dina Schlossberg, and I'm the Executive Director of Regional Housing Legal Services. I would like to thank Councilmember Goodyear and the co-sponsors to this resolution, resolution number 211029, for their interest in housing affordability and for the recognition that preservation of existing subsidized affordable housing is at a very critical juncture for the city. Some of you know who we are, but I'll tell you, Regional Housing Legal Services is a unique organization. We are a statewide nonprofit law firm and a legal aid program. Our mission is to work to create housing and economic opportunity in underserved communities in Pennsylvania and to effect systemic change for the benefit of lower income households statewide. We are not litigators. Rather, we focus on innovative project and policy solutions to help create sustainable, equitable communities that provide safe, stable, and affordable homes for all persons. We especially focus our work on developing and preserving housing for households and individuals who are lower income. We also provide legal representation to nonprofit organizations engaged in affordable housing development, preservation, and equitable development initiatives, including many nonprofit and community development organizations involved in and committed to housing affordability in Philadelphia. As Regional Housing, we have a deep expertise in housing development, regulatory systems, and financing structures. We understand the mechanics of affordable housing development and the myriad issues that encompass these systems. We do this work because we believe that housing is fundamental and that all people, regardless of income, have the right to safe, affordable homes and neighborhoods of choice. We also do this work because we recognize the racial and economic inequities that are embedded in the laws and policies of the American housing system, and we strive to find ways to redress these inequities. As recognized by Resolution 211029, the City of Philadelphia is at a crisis point when it comes to affordable housing. The need is far greater than the supply. We've heard this over and over and over again today in the testimony, but it stands to say it one more time. We cannot afford to build our way out of this crisis. As Mr. Frischkoff of LIST just stated in his testimony, our city lacks nearly 72,000 units of housing to serve our most vulnerable community members. 22% of Philadelphia households are severely cost burdened, meaning they spend 50% or more of their income on housing costs. And 54% of the city's renters are cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. This need to preserve affordable subsidized rental housing is not unique to Philadelphia. Throughout the state, it is estimated that as of 2021, over 7,600 publicly supported rental homes with affordability restrictions are expiring in the next 5 years. This is an issue that needs to be addressed in a comprehensive strategic manner here and statewide. But as a municipality, we need to galvanize around strategies to preserve existing affordable subsidized housing. Much of the subsidized housing at risk in Philadelphia is in neighborhoods such as West Philadelphia, that we've heard of over and over again today, that are experiencing deep economic and demographic changes. This is an equity issue at its basic and most fundamental. Residents who are lower income who live in historically Black gentrifying neighborhoods who are forced to relocate due to gentrification and displacement tend to move to poorer, non-gentrifying neighborhoods within the city or outside of the city, thereby further exacerbating racial segregation and inequality. Regional Housing was a founding member of the Philadelphia Preservation Network. We endorse the testimony of our partners, LISC and CLS, and that of Vince O'Donnell and Vince Riena, who are national experts on housing preservation. And we endorse the testimony of Rashida Phillips, who was a written testimony, who's just basically a national expert on all things housing. And we especially appreciate the testimony today of Ms. Alexander and Ms. Smith. Your voices, more than anybody else's voices, matter. And what you said carries more weight than almost anybody else, in my view. So one of But back to why we're trying to come up with some solutions. Among the strategies described in the testimony of LISC and others is a regulatory framework to support and encourage the preservation of existing subsidized affordable housing. We believe laws should make sure to serve and support the rights of people who are underrepresented and marginalized due to their race or their economic status. And a regulatory framework is part of the ways in which we can address and preserve and protect our most vulnerable. You've heard this before, but in 2019, the Regulation Subcommittee of the Preservation Network promoted a regulatory scheme that would provide a coordinated approach to preserving existing subsidized affordable housing development. This regulatory scheme requires that owners of existing affordable subsidized rental housing development provide notice of their intent to opt out of this regulatory framework. The goal of this notice, of course, is to provide the parties granted the notice ample time to locate a new proposed owner, or what we were calling and describing as right of first offer. That right of first offer provides some opportunity to an eligible party to acquire the development with the promise of maintaining affordability into the future. If no such proposed owner comes forward, the existing property owner is free to market the property, subject to the right for an affordable housing developer to match the purchase price of a market rate offer, should one then exist, or what we're calling matched agreement of sale. This mechanism is just critical to and essential to create a path to preserve existing subsidized affordable housing. I mean, part of the process of that is that it also requires a coordinated, comprehensive approach, of course, and bringing together all of the various parties who would who might be able to provide some financing as well as understand who would make an eligible parties to purchase. We are appreciative of Council for passage in 2019 of Bill number 0190860A, which established the beginnings of a regulatory framework that would allow for an organized and structured response to owners of existing federally subsidized developments, notice of intent to opt out of this regulatory framework. And we saw that, in fact, with University City Townhomes. We encourage City Council to go further and to adopt regulations that will enable qualified nonprofit and for-profit entities to be provided an opportunity for this right of first offer, and equally important, a matched agreement of sale to match a bona fide offer if the qualified nonprofit or for-profit commits to a renewed extended period of affordability. I want to mention that this regulatory framework that we have been describing is not novel or unique. A form of this regulatory framework has been adopted by many other municipal jurisdictions, including places such as Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., Santa Cruz, California, and Denver, Colorado. I welcome the opportunity to discuss this regulatory framework with Council as part of a comprehensive approach to addressing housing preservation in Philadelphia. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you. If everyone can mute. I have a few questions for LISC and also for regional housing, and I see that there are colleagues that have questions as well. First for LISC. We have learned in our research about other cities that allow for tenants to organize to purchase sites in danger of expiring affordability. Can you talk a little more about this option and how it could work here in Philadelphia? And I also invite Ms. Garland from CLS to weigh in on this if she chooses.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and I'm actually, if Vince O'Donnell is available and willing to help address sort of from the perspective, just while not being an expert, I'll first point to Washington, D.C., which has had sort of an exceptional mandate for giving residents the opportunity to buy, not just for subsidized apartments, and yet is, to some degree, perhaps been so successful that it's been hard to get other municipalities to replicate it. But recently, I believe in Minneapolis has now moved forward with a similar model, and I think I'll hand it to Vince in a moment. I guess what I would say is my experience in also then being able to implement once something is passed is we can't just put a law in place. we then also have to build a system or infrastructure of support. So whether it's residents like Ms. Smith and Alexander or others, that they have sort of the tools and support they need if this becomes an option. So I would just say that if we were to get to that part, we would really want to think through whether it's working with Turn or the legal services or others, what we need to have in place to then actually make it a successful model. But I'm hoping that Vince can talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of other places that have done this.
Yeah. May I add to that? Thank you, Andy. I appreciate the handoff. Yeah, I've worked with resident organizations in dozens of properties in Massachusetts and elsewhere with thousands of units that have converted to some form of resident ownership. There's quite a variety that's possible. It could be a housing cooperative. In many cases, it's a nonprofit corporation where the residents are the members of the corporation, and there are variations on a theme. We've had lots of success with that previously in the prepayment crisis, and before that, in the foreclosure crisis. There were specific incentives for resident organizations to become the owners of the properties. In order to keep them affordable, we required that those organizations also not be profit-making organizations, that they were basically there committed to permanent affordability, and that meant not taking out equity. There are lots of successes there. It does require the same resources as for a private owner to make the housing technically acceptable and both affordable and good sustainable housing. Also, though, it requires capacity building and training. And I would say we did a good job of providing that up front, and in our efforts to have that capacity building be ongoing, that was much more difficult. It does require a commitment of resources over the long haul to make sure that organizations can continue to function well and that their governance be supported. And the last thing I would say is that in order to get deep resources for redevelopment of a property, you need to go to resource providers. And really, since the Great Recession, there's been what they call in the financing industry a flight to quality, which is to say owners who are going to get resources like low-income housing tax credit equity have to show that they have high financial capacity and that they have experience already with housing development programs. This really presents a problem currently for resident ownership models, but we have so many different variations on a theme. For example, this is a great opportunity for partnership with a nonprofit that shares a commitment to long-term affordability. I'm working with a tenant group in Massachusetts that has had a 30-year partnership with a private developer. With the help of LISC and others, they have the capacity of that resident organization to be an equal partner has been supported. And at some point, they're now at the point where they could develop their own capacity and go their own way. It takes a lot of work, but there are lots of models and it can be done.
And Council Member, if it's all right, if I could ask Dina, I believe that some nonprofit owners using low-income housing tax credits have started to build in sort of the future ownership into their tax credit projects locally.
No, that is correct. There's a couple organizations nationally and a few in Ohio who have perfected the model of building in home ownership at the end of the 15-year compliance period. And we have a number of now nonprofit organizations that we're working with that are also looking at how we can control both affordability and give more resident ownership and control. So it can be done even within the construct of the limited low-income housing tax credit structure. You just have to wait the 15 years. But in the meantime, you're building up opportunities to invest in the real estate. I would also say that from my experience of working with other legal services attorneys from around the country, particularly in Washington, D.C., the TOPA and now DOPA model is one where both the residents of the building have a great opportunity for both capacity building and ownership, and often do partner either with a support services provider as a nonprofit who kind of helps keep things operating and functioning, or might come in as a partner, as Vince was describing. But there are as many variations on the theme as we probably have organizations who would be interested in buildings that would be interested in looking at these models.
May I add a point about equity? I made the point that not extracting equity is key to long-term affordability. However, there's an interesting problem right now. I think a lot of us are saying we've been doing affordable housing forever, and yet in that work, we really have not significantly addressed the financial equity gap in minority communities. And so there are folks who would say this is an opportunity to build personal equity like anybody else as a homeowner. And so there's a tension between these goals, and it requires careful thought and collaborative thinking to work out what the right compromise is. Right now, with any rental property, which would include a cooperative or a nonprofit resident-controlled entity, if there are Section 8 resources in a property, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program allows a family to build equity as their income grows. And instead of paying a tax to the federal government and have their subsidy be reduced as their income grows, they can get financial counseling, do better financially, and have the increase in their income go to a personal account, which then can go to them personally if they meet their financial goals. And they can use that for down payment on a house, or to pay tuition for college, or to buy a car to get to a job. So there are various models that require careful thought about how to execute and implement. So it's not as simple as the classic, I'm going to build equity and cash out.
And can you clarify, in the cases where tenants have been able to take over ownership of properties, where did the financial resources come from? Was it just sort of an extension of the subsidy, or how did that part work?
Sure. There were a variety of sources. Some of it was simple grant making from foundations to cover the upfront costs. Some of it came from HUD. For a while, when we had the prepayment crisis of the late 80s, early 90s, Congress authorized HUD to make specific grants for capacity building and for tenant organizing as well. And then local governments do this. In Massachusetts, the city of Boston and the state of Massachusetts both have committed resources to a quasi-public organization where I used to work. It's called CDAC, and they promote capacity building, and they were kind of like the broker for these funds, and sort of quality control to make sure that the technical assistance providers knew what they were doing and working in the best interest of the tenant clients.
Thank you. And I see Ms. Smith wants to weigh in on this conversation. Ms. Aida Smith, is your hand raised, or was it?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had I was muted. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Fiskoff and Ms. Schlossberg for understanding that as racial is inside the system, it's been a bias against people of color. And thanks for acknowledging that. I have a question going towards you mentioning there are $400 million right here in the city right now for affordable housing. I'm wondering, is any of that money going to be used? Can it be used for to beat Altman at his game, to help buy up the property? And is there anything that can be done where all of this building is being done in this area, as I stated before, but none of it won't open up for Section 8, any of the Section 8 tenants to be able to rent any of these new apartments or houses. Is there anything being done about that where it could help, where we could stay in the community and in a safe community? Because basically where we are, this is a safe area. And I know they want to take us across to someplace that's not safe. So I'm wondering what's being done and can it be done to help with owners that's building in this area to talk to them about opening up, some of these units or whatever, apartments or houses for Section 8 applicants.
Sure. So I'll take a stab at the neighborhood preservation initiative question and invite other colleagues to jump in. So the neighborhood preservation initiative will provide $400 million over a 4-year period for a variety of initiatives, but mostly affordable housing. It will go to a number of programs, including the development of affordable rental and home ownership, the preservation of affordable rental units, Philly First Home, which provides $10,000 in grant money for people to make a down payment, thereby helping them to get into their first home, as well as other initiatives. And just I say all that to say that over a 4-year period, that'll be $100 million a year divided over 10 council districts for a variety of affordable housing programs. So it's possible, I think for the city to be, in on providing a level of support to the townhomes, but that in and of itself is not going to provide enough resources. I think that, in order to get enough resources, which would be tens of millions of dollars for this extremely valuable property, we would need city resources, state resources, federal resources, and probably private resources from, foundations and institutions that would have the wherewithal to help us. So that's my personal opinion, but I don't know if other folks would want to weigh in.
Can it be done?
Yes, most things can be done. It's about, I think what you alluded to earlier, which is the will. And there would have to be so many people to be in on that conversation to demonstrate and implement enough will. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
At least it's my view of the situation.
Since you were saying, and it's been brought up, that there are organizations out there that will help with funding, to do some of the backup funding, and along with some of this money, this $400 million, that can be put to buying out Altman.
Yeah,
it can be done. I mean, it's really right there. It's simple.
It can be done.
I know people always say it's not as simple as it looks. It's not that black and white, but it is.
I agree with you. It can be done. It's about whether there are enough people who have enough will to make it happen. And those are people that go beyond me and you. But thank you for making that point. I'll let other folks weigh in on the other question. Is there, the fact that, there are so many property owners that won't take Section 8 is just a huge problem. What can be done, to Ms. Smith's point, to incentivize or push more property owners to take folks who are carrying Section 8 vouchers?
Especially since they're doing all this building around here.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ms. Schlossberg, did you want to answer that? And then Mr. O'Donnell.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts, and there's a few things. One is, probably 3 or 4. I am a lawyer. I hate to say that I kind of believe in the value of the law, so hopefully it's not always enough, but hopefully there are places where the law can be proactive. We do have a choice of income discriminatory policy in Pennsylvania. You can't, in Philadelphia, you can't discriminate based on the source of income. I recognize that, of course, the way that landlords are getting around that is by simply saying, well, you don't have enough sufficient income to pay that rent. But if there was both kind of a more enforcement of that source of income discrimination, I think that could go a long way. My understanding is many cases have come forward to like the Human Relations Commission, but they don't really go anywhere. And perhaps they could be matched with kind of an additional rental subsidy from the city. A second option might also be, my office, we have two people in particular. I'm going to kind of give them a shout out, who do tremendous work around community benefit agreements and have been very, very successful in places both in West Philadelphia, Eastern North Philadelphia, Chinatown, and North Philadelphia, where they have worked with a local nonprofit organization or the RCO or a coalition of community members to reach an agreement with a private property owner, to set aside a number of units at a rate and a cost in a rental structure for 15 to 20 years that would be available and affordable to people whose incomes are at or below 40% of area median income. So community benefits agreements and support of community benefits agreement is another opportunity. And the third, I would say, this also goes to Wilma Smith. The city gives a lot of money to a lot of developers. Make them give you something back. Have them provide access to some of their units. Say, hey, we're in a crisis. We fund you when you need something from us. Now we need something back from you. So I think that there is a way where there are developers who are getting things from the city, as somebody mentioned before, and are getting permits, and they're getting cost breaks, and they're getting tax abatements, and ways that they are getting support from the city, whether it's kind of from straight grant money or some kind of other kinds of benefit, and perhaps get something back from them in return, especially when we're in such critical need.
Wow.
Thank you so much. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the mandatory inclusionary zoning law that I worked on with Councilmember Quinones Sanchez that was just signed into law by Mayor Kinney, that will mandate that at least 20% of large developments be deeply affordable. And so hoping that can help offset this issue in the 3rd and 7th districts. Mr. O'Donnell, did you want to weigh in on this Section 8 voucher issue as well?
You're on mute.
Dina said it better. I have nothing to add, really, other than to underline that point. If the city is giving any kind of financial assistance for anything, a covenant not to discriminate against voucher holders is something that can be done, doesn't cost the city anything.
Yeah, thank you. I like that idea. Are there any additional questions or comments from members of the committee? Okay. So there being none, that concludes panel testimony for this resolution. We will now begin hearing from individuals who have registered to provide public comment. Ms. Schultz, will you please read the name of the first person registered for public comment?
Yes, council member, I believe that council support needs to call them into the hearing.
Oh, okay. Should we break for a few minutes to do that?
Like that. Hello?
Never
First
mind, here we are.
is connected to Teams, Madam Chair.
Can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Are the public comment folks on the line? Or is that what you're saying? Or do we need to call that? Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm on the line. Daoud Bey.
Wonderful. Mr. Bey, can you state, well, I think you already stated your name for the record. Can you proceed with your testimony, and good afternoon?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daoud Bey, and I'm testifying today as a member of the Building Industry Association of Philadelphia. I want to thank Chair Gauthier and the rest of this committee for allowing me to provide testimony on Resolution 211029 regarding the impact of expiring affordable housing subsidies on Philadelphia. I was raised in the Point Breeze area of the city. I have been surrounded by crime throughout my life and understand that access to clean, safe, affordable housing is critical to helping people get out of the cycle of poverty that they feel they have been stuck in. It is a key component to get out of poverty, therefore a safer city. The investment in home ownership and community healing has proven to reduce gun violence. As a returning citizen, anti-gun violence activist, contractor, and growing real estate developer, I have seen the benefits of affordable housing projects provide to people in need. The federal subsidies that are a topic of this hearing have provided housing that the city would not otherwise have. But those costly subsidies expire, and it is the city of Philadelphia's job to fill this gap. Expiring subsidies are only an issue because Philadelphia has failed to adopt policies that will consistently feed the pipeline of new affordable housing. The city has had 40 years to plan for when the terms of these subsidized housing projects would end, and could have ensured the rate of new affordable housing being built outpaced the units expiring subsidies. Those would be modern units These would be modern units that meet the needs of today's residents and families. The city owns thousands of parcels, but has failed to leverage these assets amidst an affordable housing crisis. City Council has the power to move the needle and address this crisis now, but it continues to squander its best opportunity to generate significant opportunities of affordable housing for its residents. If you want more affordable units, allow disposition of public land to the private sector, as well as consistent with current law, so that affordable housing can be built at a meaningful scale. Private sector developers and BIA membership have the financial capabilities and resources to help solve this problem, and the willingness to be the city's partner. Instead of adopting policies that block the private sector from producing affordable housing, we encourage you to use the $400 million in NPI funds that the BIA supported to buy down affordability levels on public land disposition. I have been on the BIA Affordable Housing Committee for the last year and have seen its plan for affordable housing. I have also been qualified as a participant in the PHDC Minority Developer Program. Now more than ever, I understand that the lack of affordable housing is a crisis that City Council has the power to solve. The previously subsidized buildings are unable to be maintained and run effectively at their current rental rates without additional subsidies. New, more efficient, modern units are needed now, as well as a growing demand for senior housing. There are seasoned developers who truly want to reinvest in our communities and are ready to help if you give them access to land. We understand how to finance and build the needed projects, and we have demonstrated how it can work in the BIA's Affordable Housing Blueprint. We urge City Council to work together with the private sector and to put those empty lots to work, helping those that need it the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bay. Miss Mary McGettigan, are you there and connected? Okay. Do we need to dial her in?
Do I need to hang up?
You don't have to hang up. You can hang on.
Hello?
But thank you. Is this Miss Mary McGettigan?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Right now? Yes. Good morning, Chairwoman Gauthier and committee members. I am Mary McGettigan, President of West Philly Plan and Preserve, a registered... Good morning.
We hear you. Please proceed.
Good morning, Chair Gauthier and committee members. I'm Mary McGettigan, President of West Philly Plan and Preserve, a registered community organization. I'd like to thank Councilmember Gauthier for proposing this resolution and for chairing this meeting, and would ask you all to vote in support of public hearings on this issue of vital concern to West Philadelphians.
Okay.
Now, statistics demonstrate the great need to preserve and increase affordable housing in our city. Unfortunately, it's easy for the unaffected person to ignore statistics, but when this crisis affects your own near neighbors, as it did mine, the issue becomes impossible to ignore. When the nonprofit owner of the Arvilla Apartments decided to opt out and sell for market rate development, they evicted the residents of 20 previously subsidized units. We neighbors attempted to stop the sale, the evictions of our friends and neighbors, and the permanent removal of these affordable subsidized homes from our block, but to no avail. And I have to thank Rachel Garland and CLS for assisting us in this effort. Now, evictions like those that took place at the Arvilla and are proposed at the University City townhomes may be legal, but they are certainly not just. And they are not only unjust, they are cruel. At the Arvilla, the effects were tragic, leading to the death of an 82-year-old who had resided there for 50 years. And our neighborhood was changed for the worse by the loss of our neighbors and of affordable homes. When we met with several city council members at the time, we were warned that we should not expect to find an answer to this problem in city council. I hope that that discouraging assessment is no longer true. The time has come for the city, in its development zeal, to stop waving the banner of property rights as somehow superior to human rights, particularly the right to shelter. With regard to the University City townhomes, the city not only anticipated the expiration of subsidized housing well in advance, it was actually planning for it. I attended a final planning department meeting where city planners presented residents of the University City Southwest area with a series of maps showing how the city, through its Philadelphia 2035 comprehensive plan, intended to develop our area. I pointed out to the city planner that the city appeared to be planning to replace UCTH with a dense upscale development, including a hotel and retail. And this is many years ago. I asked him why the city would eliminate affordable housing there and what would become of the current residents who clearly constituted a thriving community. He informed me that the property was not city-owned, but private property. The young planner had never heard of the Black Bottom community that thrived in the area, had been decimated by eminent domain, and of which the University City townhomes was a remnant. The irony of the continuation of this exploitative urban renewal project escaped him, as it apparently escapes many civic leaders today. So, to finish, it's clear that there are limitations to what city government can do to build and preserve subsidized housing. The guest speakers have laid out a number of strategies that the city could pursue to address this growing crisis. We hope the City Council will take up this challenge, beginning with the public hearings proposed by the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McGettigan, for your testimony, for your work with Arvilla, and for highlighting, the city's complicity along with local institutions in, the removal of the Black Bottom, how the townhomes got here in the first place, which, as you rightly state, makes it even more imperative that we be at the table to affect a different outcome. Thank you. Mr. Ryan Spack, are you there and connected? Do we need to get Ryan Spack on?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Hi, this is Ryan Spack.
We hear you. Go proceed.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Wanted to provide some insight into the work that our company, SPAC Group, is doing along the lines of this committee hearing. Recently, we have come to find that partnerships are a very creative way to ensure that both the development industry as well as affordable housing operators can keep affordable housing intact. Recently, we completed a partnership with Friends Rehabilitation Program, which is a 75-year-old not-for-profit agency that had control over an affordable housing development in Strawberry Mansion. This particular property housed 44 apartments and an additional 3 vacant units. We, as a company, as SPAC Group, we proposed a partnership in which those properties were moved into a private entity. That private entity was owned both by the not-for-profit and SPAC Group, and allowed for SPAC Group to utilize its balance sheet and its ability to borrow capital to not only borrow capital to put $750,000 worth of capital improvements into the project, but we were able to then utilize those monies to take what was essentially a development with only a quarter occupancy to full occupancy. But the wonderful part of this partnership was we extended the deed restriction 25 years. So the affordability of these units remained intact. And at the time that we did this partnership, the affordability restriction was only a few years away from its expiration. One of the other caveats and benefits to this partnership was the repayment of almost $700,000 in public funds to PHFA, allowing those funds to go back into the system to be put back into other affordable housing projects. And so it's these type of creative partnerships that we wanted to allow council to know about and the public, because we think that there are more opportunities like this where a not-for-profit can utilize private balance sheets to borrow capital, to invest in affordable housing, to keep it affordable without selling these developments for pennies on the dollar. In our partnership, FRP has voting rights. FRP has the ability to ensure that SPAC Group can't over-leverage these properties. They have the ability to see every single solitary budget on an annual basis, and it has the ability to vote if that budget were to go beyond 10% in expenses for any line item. So there are restrictions put in place to ensure that our partnership is forever vigilant. And so I hope that that kind of creativity gives pause that there are opportunities for partnerships here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Spack, for highlighting that example. I hadn't heard of that, and I absolutely think that's the type of creativity we need in this moment as we're projecting, the potential opt-out of so many units. And thank you also for your work as a responsible, community-minded developer in West Philadelphia, as well as in other areas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay. Are there any additional questions or comments for these testifiers from members of the committee? Okay. There being no further questions from members of the committee and no other witnesses to testify, I will ask if there is anyone else present in this hearing whose name we have failed to call and that wishes to offer testimony on the resolution being considered today. Hearing none, this concludes the business before the Committee on Housing, Neighborhood Development, and the Homeless today. I very much want to thank all of my colleagues and all of the panelists and testifiers for speaking today. Thank you for sharing your personal and often painful experiences. Thank you for sharing so many ideas about what we can be doing as a city at this critical time. And, this is, for me, this is a conversation that doesn't just stop at this hearing. And I look forward to working together both on the immediate issue at hand, the University City townhomes, as well as the broader issue to make sure that families are not displaced. Thank you so very much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We appreciate you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I appreciate
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.